Good afternoon to our viewers in Switzerland, and hello to all those joining us in America. I am thrilled to welcome you in the name of the Latin American Chamber of Commerce in Switzerland to our webinar on Latin America's challenges in a world in disruption. Some of you may remember that I said in our finance webinar a month ago that in many ways the world today doesn't resemble anymore the world of a year ago. To be honest, it doesn't resemble the world of 2 weeks ago. Like in a never-ending boot camp, we are gasping for breath, trying to adjust to one disruption while there is another already on the brink of happening. Since World War II, there have not been so many regions in crisis or war at the same time as now. This also means that political ramifications and economic impact instantly concern us all. That's why we are privileged to introduce a speaker today whose broad knowledge and expertise predestines him to bring those challenges in perspective and outline opportunities on the horizon. A warm welcome, Professor Felipe Larraín.
Hello,
And
very glad to be here, and
we're glad
I
to
hope we
have you.
have a fruitful session. Am I on? Are you hearing me well? Yes.
We're hearing you well, yes.
Oh, okay.
And we are lucky
So
to have our moderator of choice, so to say in-house, ready to offer his best performance each time. Welcome to our friend, Dr. Philippe Nel.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Before we kick off the dialogue, it is my pleasure to introduce LATCAM's president, Linda Walker, who has known Professor Larraín for many years and agreed to say a few personal words. Welcome, Linda. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Tatiana.
I
Dear
want to let
LATCAM,
Just
sorry, go ahead.
1 second, I want to let our viewers know that the webinar is recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, LATCAM Switzerland, for those who cannot assist here live. At the end of the session, we will have time for Q&A. Please write your questions in the Q&A section. If you prefer, you can do it anonymously. And now, Linda, platform is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tatiana. Dear LATCAM members and friends, it is a great honor to introduce our speaker today, Felipe Larraín, Professor Felipe Larraín. I have had the privilege of knowing Felipe for more than 25 years. We first met at the World Economic Forum, and over the years, our paths have crossed frequently, including many meetings in Santiago. Throughout this time, I have consistently admired his intellectual rigor, public service, and commitment to advancing economic thought. Felipe Larraín is well known to many of you, having served twice as Minister of Finance of Chile. Beyond his public service, he is an inspiring academic and thought leader. He has recently established a chair in economics and artificial intelligence created through a partnership with La Universidad Católica and dedicated to the memory of his parents. An initiative that reflects both scholarly innovation and personal legacy. In addition, Felipe has founded the Network of Think Tanks of the Americas, CEPAS, a platform designed to foster the exchange of ideas and experiences across the region, with a focus on economic, social, and political development. The launch of this network marks an important milestone in promoting constructive dialogue and regional cooperation across the Americas. We are truly fortunate to have such a knowledgeable and forward-looking speaker with us today, someone uniquely positioned to help us understand the Americas in a global environment that is evolving at an unprecedented pace. Felipe, thank you very much for joining us. And now I pass the word on to Professor Philippe Nel.
Thank you, Linda. I am very pleased to host you today, Professor Larraín. Let me welcome you and our audience warmly and begin with a few introductory remarks. The world economy and Latin America face presently very serious challenges. I will highlight 2 points. First, President Trump's fair and reciprocal tariff policy and trade agreements with several countries are redefining international trade relations. The US aims at bringing its trade deficit down and at getting large investments in plans to reindustrialize the country. The US has also used threats of high tariffs to exert political pressure on non-trade related issues with countries such as Brazil, Colombia, and several EU countries on Greenland and defense spending. To avoid a damaging trade war, the European Union has concluded a reciprocal trade agreement with the US, so did several Asian and Latin American countries. On February 20, the US Supreme Court ruled against President Trump's use of tariffs. President Trump has immediately replaced the former tariffs with a 10% tariff under Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, which had never been used before and was established for other purposes. The new tariff can be maintained for 5 months without congressional approval. A second big challenge results from the war in Iran and its dramatic consequences through the Middle East and impact on the world economy. The situation is very serious. We are going to look now at some implications for Latin America with Professor Larraín. Our discussion will be divided in 3 parts. First, impact of the Iran war and America First policy. Second, Latin America's economic integration perspectives. And third, Latin America's need for reforms. Let me turn to part 1, Iran war and US-America First policy. With the war in Iran, the price of oil and gas has skyrocketed. The International Energy Agency just said today the world is facing the largest supply disruption in the history of global oil market. As Iran escalates attacks on ships, 3 ships only today were attacked, oil ships, and the release of emergency oil stocks failed to calm prices. We are very worried in Europe on the impact on inflation and growth. So, Professor, how do you see the consequences for Latin American economies?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you, Linda, for your generous introduction, and thank you, Professor Nell, for your initial thoughts and staging the ground for our discussion, and also thank the Latin American Chamber of Commerce in Switzerland. I think that we are in a very of course, analytically, it's very interesting, but what's happening may be kind of damaging to the world economy. We have the experiences of another very different oil shocks. If you remember the 73-74 shock, when oil prices not just increased by 10, 20, or 50%, but at that time we had a 3-fold or 4-fold increase, which was basically the establishment of a cartel, of an international cartel on the price of oil, on oil among oil producers, which was the beginning of OPEC. And this group then again in 79-80. And the consequences on the world economy was what we call economists stagflation. Stagflation, which is stagnation with inflation, which is a pretty sour combination. And we had a recession, a world recession, based on just the increase in the price of oil. What is different now? Well, certainly the oil prices have not tripled. They have increased significantly by about 50%, which is a large increase. And we have a basic, result in economics that for every 10% increase in the price of oil, the world economy, if it's sustained, because of course there is a scenario where all this will revert, and the war lasts 1 month and not more, and maybe that will be the case, but we cannot assure that. It seems even if we look at President Trump's first words, and first statements, he said, well, this will last 4 days. Then he went on and said it was like 4 weeks, and we don't know. Russia invaded Ukraine and never thought that we will be 4 years into the conflict. So you start a conflict and you don't know where the conflict will end. So if it's sustained, for every 10% increase of in the price of oil in the world economy, you have between 0.1 and 0.2% lower growth. So if you put together 50% increase in oil prices, which is about where we are right now, you will have a 1% about, maybe a 1% decline in world output or lower growth, which is so, and this will disrupt. This is when the world is growing, at 3%, which is about what world economic growth is right now, that you have maybe a 1 percentage point decline, it leaves you at 2, and that's a very, very slow growth, and will have significant impacts, and we will have disruptions in world trade. And of course, as you said, Professor Nell, that this morning or yesterday, we had this attack on the 3 ships, and all the ships that are crossing the Strait of Hormuz. And interestingly, about 30% of trade, world oil trade, passes through the Hormuz Strait, which is south of Iran, and but Iran is and the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and whatever goes to Europe goes through the Suez Canal, and goes to the Red Sea and the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, which is interesting because that's whatever is exported to Europe, but then whatever is exported to Asia passes through the Strait of Malacca, which is the start of the meridional China Sea. So this is a very important disruption for the world economy if we have a conflict that stays. In this scenario, Latin America, we have very different realities here because we have oil exporters. And for oil exporters, this is the world lower growth is partly compensated by higher oil prices. But we have countries in Latin America, for example, if you think Venezuela is an oil exporter, so it's a windfall for Venezuela that the price of oil goes from 60 to 90, let's say. Ecuador, a net oil exporter. Colombia, net oil exporter. But then you go south and you find countries like Chile, my own, where the local consumption of oil derivatives, and fuels and diesel and so on, about 99% is imported. Local production is extremely low. We are long on copper, short on oil. So Mexico is an oil exporter, but there are many countries in the region which are not sufficient and not exporters, but importers. And for those countries, this is certainly, as a first issue, this is certainly a bad news. It is bad news and for everyone that the world economy is growing less. That would be maybe 0.5% or 1 percentage point less. That's bad news in itself. But maybe you are compensated because you're an oil producer. But if you're not, and you're an oil importer and extremely dependent on world markets, then it's a negative. So you have on the trade, you have this negative, effect on world growth. The other part is the increase in uncertainty. The geopolitical uncertainty. Well, Tatiana was mentioning in her initial words that we, at this stage, we have several regions in the world where we have confrontations, open wars, confrontations. This is not a very favorable scenario for, let's say, long-term investment, that you have this significant source of uncertainty. So I would say, and this, of course, then goes into financial markets, which is the third point, because on financial markets, you have interest rates, which were on a cycle of, in several countries, important countries like the US, we were expecting, a reduction of the monetary policy rate. And now we're expecting the probability of that reduction has declined, and maybe we'll have a lower reduction of interest rates. So we have a world with higher inflation, higher interest rates. If this war, which is our initial, I would say, our initial assumption, which is if it stays. If it doesn't stay, then we have a transitory disruption on the world economy. Latin America, widely open, increasingly open region of the world. And some countries within Latin America, among them, for example, Chile, is probably the most open country for trade in the region. So this is, I would say, the situation. And Latin America is now growing by about 2% per year. So it's growing about 1 percentage point less than the world economy. So we don't want a disruption of the world economy. We're already struggling to try to get higher than the 2% that we have right now. So let me start with that, Philippe.
Okay, thank you very much, Leonard. Now, I think your remarks are very pertinent, and I fully share your analysis. Now, we will know more in about a month or two to see if the crisis we are living through right now can be dealt with, or if we go into the scenarios that you just presented right now. But it's also positive to highlight, as you said, that we have not a tripling of the price of oil as we had earlier in the 1970s. The scope is different, but nevertheless, the impact on the world economy is going to be quite significant. Let me now turn to the US tariffs. Yes.
Sorry, yes, just one small point, which I think is important, which I forgot to mention. The world, very different issue from the 1970s to the 2020s, where we are right now, is that in this more than bit over 50 years that have gone by, the world has become more efficient in the use of oil. Let me be very precise on an economist with my economist bias, that the amount of oil required to produce a unit of world output has declined significantly. So we are not in the position of so heavy and huge oil dependency as we had in the early 70s. And you're seeing that, for example, that vehicles have gotten much more efficient in the use of fuel, and that every activity we have the penetration, which is important, of renewable non-traditional sources of energy in several places of the world. And I think that is, and in general, countries are becoming less dependent on fossil fuels. That's a good thing, and that makes also a difference from what we had in the early 70s.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Very good point. Let me now turn to the US tariffs. The US continues to be one of the largest export markets for most Latin American countries. Argentina, Ecuador, and El Salvador and Guatemala have signed recently a reciprocal trade agreement with the United States. Switzerland is finalizing such an agreement, and the EU Parliament may vote by the end of the month on the EU-US agreement. Now, how do you see the perspective for Latin American countries dealing with the US administration, and what has been Chile's position under the former government?
Yes, well, actually, a very important point you say, Philippe, under the former government, because particularly speaking on Thursday, the 12th, we just had the change of government yesterday, so we have a new government now, but the government is really 1 day old, So, but we know that there are going to be very important differences between the government that is assuming that is getting to power and the government that just left yesterday. So, but let me say, first of all, I have always been in favor of free trade. So these policies of free trade, and of course, with all the, you have to be careful in trade that you have the anti-dumping institutions, because if you have dumping into your economies, which could unfairly hurt local industry, then you will have ways to protect it. But living within rules, I'm for a world that lives on a multilateral framework. And I think this should be probably, not only because of conceptually, I think it's correct, but also it's what small countries need to have. They need to have rules and to be part of the, That's why we're part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We're part of several organizations in the world because we are part of a multilateral system with rules. And when one big party just basically does not consider and and scraps the rules and starts playing and putting tariffs, well, then I think we are certainly in a world that is, we have less trade, with less globalization, which has some problems, but it also has very important benefits, the globalization. So in this issue, I would first state that point, that I think a more protectionist world is not conducive to a better economic prospects for the world as a whole. Of course, then on that situation, that's for the world as a whole. Then you have to see what happens to your region, to Latin America. And in Latin America, I think the Supreme Court, this is a global issue, the Supreme Court just told the government, the US government, that they cannot rule by emergency decrees, that they need to go, if they want to put tariffs, they need to go to Congress, which is fair. Every country, in our country, for example, the institutions work. And, the government could not just put tariffs, they have to go to Congress and they have to pass legislation in Congress. That's what every country, with institutions, does. But in this particular case, the Supreme Court, which has, it's interesting because there was a majority of conservative judges. Many of them had been appointed by President Trump. Yet, half of those judges, the conservative judges, voted against this emergency decrees. So now we're back into the U.S. Trade Act of 74 that you pointed out. Well, that Trade Act, we're in better ground, because by emergency decrees, the U.S. government can do whatever they want, but under the U.S. Trade Act of 74, they could place 10%, which is what they have, or 15, up to 15% for 150 days. Basically for 5 months, and then if they want to extend it, they need to go to Congress. So this is a different world, and I think what the Supreme Court did is a very positive thing. But not only positive for the rest of the world, let me be clear here, I think it's very positive for the US as well, because policy needs to be, you need to have some ways to predict what policy does. Otherwise, the uncertainty of any change that happens without any study. When you do public policy, and I've been involved on public policy. I was for 6 years finance minister in Chile. We try to do a study of the effects of our, policies. Well, in this case, I'm not sure whether the studies are, but I haven't seen them. That will be the basis, or that would, be the backing of the measures that we have seen. So under the current scenario, we have 10% tariff for 150 days, maybe up to 15. We don't know. They could do that, but they cannot go over 15. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court said. Under that scenario, let me make an important caveat. You mentioned, Philippe, that there is a number of countries that are signing trade agreements with the US. Yeah. Well, let me say that my country is one of them, but not now. We signed a trade agreement a long time ago, and the trade agreements are precisely, a voluntary agreement among, in this case, sovereign nations. Well, the idea that you have an agreement like this, so no country in the agreement can violate the agreement on a unilateral basis. If there are changes, they need to be by consensus of the parties who are the signatories of the trade agreement. We are now under negotiations, good faith negotiations with the US. But basically, our main point is that, well, we want the trade agreement that was signed by the US government and the Chilean government to be respected. Mm-hmm. Under that agreement, we should have no extra tariffs.
Yeah.
No extra tariffs. Yet we had the minimum, which was 10%.
Mhm.
And it's actually maybe an anecdote, but usually some of us, do remember the formula that was used to explain or to support those tariffs. The formula basically it depends on the increase in your tariff depends on your deficit, your trade deficit uh, with the trade deficit of the US with the country. So the larger the trade deficit of the US, the bigger the tariff. But the US have a trade surplus with Chile. So we not only have a trade agreement, but we have a trade surplus. We shouldn't have gotten a tariff. In fact, if the formula had been applied, well, there was this overall minimum of 10%, but if the formula just precisely would have been applied, we should have gotten a reduction in the tariff with the US. So let me just say that and also mention another very important aspect. For Mexico, of course, the US is the main trading partner by far. About 80% of Mexican exports go to the US. In Central America, grossly speaking, Central America and the Caribbean, let's say 50% of exports go to the US. And if you count services, it's a bit more because on services, you have a lot of tourism, for example, the tourism coming from America to the Caribbean and Central America. When you go south, the situation changes. Colombia, still main trading partner is the US. But when you go to Peru, to Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile, which is the southern part of the region, southern, central south, then you have that the main trading partner is significantly above is China. So there's a very different reality. If Mexico competes with China for access to the US, we are economies which are very complementary with China. And we export many things. Well, in Chile, our main staple of exports is copper. Peru also first or second most important export is copper. But then you have Brazil. Brazil trades more with China than with the US. So we have a mixed reality here. And I think what this will do is if you face higher tariffs in a very important trading partner, because even if China would be in some countries the most important trading partner, you still have the US as the second trading partner. Let me just give you the figures for Chile. About 40% of Chile's exports go to China, 15% to the US. And that's number two. That's generally the situation, although Chile is the most dependent on the China market for the goods we sell abroad. If you consider this and you have one very significant trading partner that is imposing tariffs on you, most countries have decided not to retaliate. No retaliation. It would be foolish for a small country to retaliate on the US. Of course, you want to sit and try to have a relationship with a trusted partner, that suddenly changes because it imposes on you the tariffs, but no retaliation. But what will happen is that likely you will increase trade with those partners that are not imposing tariffs on you. And in particular, there is a market that Latin America has explored very little, which is India. We have very small integration with India, which happens to be the most populated country in the world right now, with about 1.42 billion people, slightly more than China, which has a little bit less, by a few millions less, but still today, India is a very fast growing. It's growing, significantly more than China. China is growing, at about 5, but maybe 4.5 to 5, and then India has been growing closer to 7. So fastest growing, largest population in the world, and a very closed economy, India. So it is interesting, and we are all looking into India. We'd like to integrate further and to establish true free trade agreements, which have not been easy because India is a protectionist, and maybe that will change. Hopefully, they will discover the benefits of having an open trading system with the rest of the world. So that would be my first, line of thought here, Philip.
No, thank you very much. Indeed, the key words is now diversification. Diversification. We have to insist on also other markets. Switzerland just concluded with India a free trade agreement a few months ago. The European Union did also that. It's going to take time for trade to increase, but nevertheless, this is the right direction. And in addition to that, many countries now are seeking to conclude an agreement with the US, a fair and reciprocal trade agreement, in order to secure, a situation as long as we will have to live under that particular situation. But the requirements are also very high. On the Swiss side, we have to commit for $200 billion investment in the next 4 or 5 years. And we will see how this can be done. But this is the way forward for the time being. We are working according to that plan. And looking at Latin America, the US and China, there is another element which I wanted to raise with you. It is what we call now, the US indeed is very ambitious now for the Western Hemisphere and has developed what is called the Don Roy doctrine. So that the US, looking back to assert American predominance in the Western Hemisphere. And at the same time, China has been very active over the past 30 years in Latin America, looking at in terms of investment in Peru and in Venezuela and in Ecuador and in a number of other countries. So how do you assess really this Don Roy doctrine, looking at the present situation in Latin America and the strong foothold of China on the trade side, as you just mentioned, and also on the investment side in Latin America?
Yes, well, this is some people. I mean, if you put a positive view on this, because you're going to have the two views. What is positive on the view? Well, first of all, it apparently, because in some governments, the U.S., it's almost that it hasn't noticed Latin America. Well, now they've noticed, that we have this region where they notice that we have this region with about 670, 80 million people, which is about 8% of the world economy, and which has some very interesting potentials, particularly on rare earths. This the new minerals that could be very important in production for data centers and some of the issues of the new technologies that are becoming available. So that's the positive view. The negative view is, and I would have published a couple of papers on this, arguing that Latin America should not choose. We should not be required to choose between our two most important trading partners, that we should be open, fair, and transparent in the relation. We have two very important trading partners, which are China and the US. For some countries, US would be more important than China if you go north, but if you go south, China would be more important than the US. And the idea that we should close the economy to China in many ways, not just on trade, but on investment, I don't think it's a good idea. I think we have a very important partner here. In many cases, suppose we say, okay, no, we are going to reduce our trade. Where do we send our 40% of our exports, which are, to give you an idea, Chile has just passed $100 billion in exports. And, about 40 billion go to China, and 15 billion go to the US. So sure, we want to have friendly, open, transparent relationships with both. And I have suggested that on the hemispheric basic for the whole region, for the whole Latin America, that's probably in the best interest. Of course, when you go north, the US would have more of an influence because it's a larger trading partner. But when you go south, and you have this this dependency on China, then we need to be very careful. And the only way to do this is, as I say, transparent. And you may have some regulations regarding foreign investment, okay? But those regulations should be known, should be clear, and should be applicable to all.
No, thank you very much. And in my opinion, if we talk about the Don Roy doctrine, what would be needed, and already now since quite a few years, would be like a Marshall Plan for Central America, so that Central America could finally be able to reach a development level through education, through infrastructure, allowing the people to get some good income and to be able then to stay in Central America and develop all the area. That could be a good Don Ray doctrine, I would say, to work on Central America to make that area in conditions to enable people really to have a good living conditions.
Well, interestingly, I think very different realities. We talk about regions here, Central America, and yes, I think that there are many ways that where the U.S. could help to develop the region. One important way to develop the region is through open markets. To have open markets, but then, of course, there may be a very interesting infrastructure initiative or education initiative and so on. But let's also consider that Central America and the Caribbean is a very diverse region. You have, if you look at it, in Central America and the Caribbean, you have the richest country in Latin America, which is currently Panama, and the poorest country, which is Haiti. So you have Haiti and you have the Panama. And Panama is mainly a service economy. As opposed to other economies in Latin America, the typical Latin American story is economies which are heavily dependent on natural resources. And
Yeah.
Panama does have natural resources, but they are more dependent on the Panama Canal, on financial services. So mainly a service economy. Tourism, very important in Panama as well, and less on natural resources, although they do have. They have, for example, an important production of copper, one mine which was closed recently, a very significant mine, by the way, a copper mine. And on the other hand, yes, you have countries which are heavily dependent on natural resources. So reality is different. You go from the extremes also, the richest and the poorest, right there. And one way to understand, because some people, analysts, have tended to say, well, the reality geography is so important. How do you explain if geography is what, geography meaning access, location in the world, where access to the sea, and weather, whether you have a tropical or you have a temperate climate. How do you explain that the same island would have a fast-growing, thriving economy like Dominican Republic, and you have Haiti, separated by a land border and sharing the same island? Well, that says that institutions, public policies matter a lot for growth. So I think our take here is that we need to, and maybe I don't want to just let me throw the title here because maybe that will be our last point of discussion. Integration in the region is very important, and yet a very basic level of integration in Latin America. We don't have, not at all, what you have in what there is in Europe with the European Union. Well, that is kind of a level of integration that we can only dream in Latin America. Our level of integration is much more, sort of basic, and also, we can just start by saying maybe we should start with trade, let alone having a common market. like Europe has, or or the level of integration in EFTA, EFTA. So maybe we should somewhere else to look at a level of integration that could be challenging but doable for us.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, integration was our next topic, and you just started on that very well. Intra-regional trade in Latin America is only 13% of overall trade. And therefore, despite the fact there are many preferential agreements and free trade agreements all across Latin America, Yadish Bhagwati was talking about a spaghetti ball. So many links, relationships there are, difficult to see them all. How do you assess the state of Latin American integration process? The Pacific Alliance raised a lot of expectations that were set up with Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. But finally, we didn't come up to what was the really aim of a free movement of goods and services and persons and also capital. So where do you see the major barriers for Latin American integration really to come up to a level that would enable more trade and more exchanges?
Sadly, I think, with the level of integration in Latin America is very low. We have many free trade agreements and different trade agreements. You have, for example, Mercosur. Yeah. You have the Andean Pact. You have CARICOM. You have the Central America Integration Pact, and you have the Pacific Agreement, and the level of integration interregional trade is very low. It's very fragmented. These integrations that we see we have not been really ambitious, and we haven't had the political will to have a broad region-wide trade agreement, which could make a big difference for us. Of course, just integrating between ourselves will not solve our problems, because we'll solve all our problems because, Latin America needs to be integrated with the world. But it would help to have a big trading area and solve, in a way, the spaghetti bowl that Professor Bhagwati was, Jagdish Bhagwati used to say. On my view, we should probably look more to ASEAN, the Asia Economic Integration Agreement, which is more sort of less ambitious than the European Union, but that is, I think, is much more profound, much deeper than the current level of integration that we have in the region. And we haven't been able to really say, okay, guys, Mercosur has 4 or 5 members, 4 founding members, which were Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And we have the Pacific Alliance. And I was part of the foundation of the Pacific Alliance when I was finance minister. And we had, with President Piñera and President Alan Garcia, and we had a level of integration and a very promising avenue, and suddenly we had some political discrepancies in this agreement, in the Pacific Alliance, and for example, between Peru and Mexico. So Mexico would not at the point, we have a rotating presidency, and the presidency was supposed to rotate once a year. And so it's called a pro-temporary president. And the presidency was supposed to rotate from Mexico to Peru, and it didn't do because there was a big quarrel between the two countries, a big disagreements. And I frankly think I was very enthusiastic with the Pacific Alliance. Many countries starting to not join, but be, become part of it as observers. Before other countries, started to go in. But then I think, we did not create the institutions that would be strong enough to resist the political tendencies of different governments. And now we have the Pacific Alliance I would love to say that it's thriving. I think it's sleeping.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. It has been a disappointment. For instance, Nestle, who is a patron of our chamber, I remember when I was discussing with them in Chile, they were producing, some cookies and chocolates and so on and so forth, but they were facing differences in the technical norms between Chile and Peru, for instance, not enabling them, to produce in one country for both of them because of sugar content, salt contents, and all of that. And it's a pity that these even kind of technical norms could not be harmonized, harmonized or mutually recognized across in order for business to be able to use fully the benefits of the region. But this is the way it has been, this way it is, and for the near future, I think we don't see too much progress to be expected. As you mentioned, you refer also to ASEAN. ASEAN, indeed, in terms of economic potential, is remarkable. It is remarkable, and several countries in South America have ties with ASEAN. So these markets are really very, very big, and there is some future into ASEAN. Switzerland is also looking into ASEAN based on the dynamism that we experience over there, and also the opportunities.
Let me make a couple of examples where I think integration is not just lowering tariffs. That's one part of integration. But integration, for example, is to have this single windows for trade.
Yes.
Ventanilla única that we have discussed many times. And we say, okay, we should have a regional single window so that it's not just that exports go easily, but that, exports and imports, come and go easily from our countries. And if you have a particular integration, and the single windows, just some people may not be familiar with this, the single windows is basically that for an export, you need several permits, from different agencies, and you should do it probably, remotely and not queues or lines or documents. Documents should flow, through the web and not, just having a huge red tape on the way out or in the way in for goods. So that expedites trade, and that is, I think, one example. The other example is that, and that's a very interesting point for the Pacific Alliance, is the MILA, which is the Mercado Integrado Latinoamericano, the integrated Latin American market for stock markets. And for that, you need to have some regulations. Regulations, for example, is that if a company is in good standing in your country, then it's in good standing in the whole region, but in good standing with your local regulator. That local regulation will be considered sufficient at the regional level. That needs that regulators talk, coordinate, discuss how can they converge as much as they can. So we're talking here about trade, we're talking about financial market integration. In the Pacific Alliance, we have even shared embassies, because all countries do not have embassies everywhere in the world. So maybe in some countries, maybe Colombia could serve as the embassy for the rest of the, to have the representation of the region. And that is a way to truly integrate. So there are many more than just the trade and tariffs, and quotas. Much integration goes well beyond that.
No, I think there are some very concrete examples to look at, to be inspired of. Like in Europe, we have CEN, the European Center for Normalization, and also for electronics, where thousands of norms are being developed by experts from all the countries, and then they become European norms, and it facilitates a lot the trade between the countries, and also the use of the products. Maybe we should ask Tatiana now if there are any questions that came through a desk.
Indeed, Philippe. Just a second.
Because we have 10 more minutes, so let's now look at the
have 10 more minutes, and there's one question. What is your opinion regarding US military presence in Latin America, and specifically the planned increased presence in Paraguay on Brazil's border? coupled with the movement for the US to classify Brazilian domestic organized crime groups as terrorists, which the US claims gives them the right to attack them in Brazilian territory. Thank you.
Well, first of all, we just had a meeting over that over the last weekend in Miami. There was a meeting attended by many Latin American presidents and under this U.S. initiative called Shield of the Americas. And let me start from rather than going to the more specific issue of the presence on some country. I think the only way to fight organized crime is through cooperation and international cooperation. We have, and my country is an example on this, we are now having types of crime that were not existent before. And we just not only have local gangs, but have some international gangs. The Tren de Aragua, for example, which is a Venezuelan-born these are really crime multinationals. And you cannot fight crime multinationals just with your own resources. You need to cooperate. So I regard cooperation on crime as a very important issue. Whether you would allow the U.S. presence in your territory, well, I think that's a part of national sovereignty that each country should be free to decide. Each country, that's not something at a regional level, but at a national level, and regarding the bilateral relationship that you have with the U.S. or with whoever. And my view is we are going to lose the war on crime, on organized crime, if we don't have a very strong international cooperation in the region. And let me just say, and sadly say, because Ecuador is a country I like very much. I've worked on Ecuador, and it has suffered in the last 5 years a huge increase in crime. Yes. One of the statistics that are most widely seen is the number of deaths, assassinations per 100,000 people, and that has, probably quadrupled, fivefold increase in that. And, gangs that are, and the gangs, these crime or criminal organizations which are really multinationals and are very efficient, by the way. We should not think that we are with local thugs which are not very experienced. These operate like an efficient international corporation, except that they are criminal corporations. And those require this concerted action. We have a number of those organizations right now. And the other part, which is important, is suppose you are, and I think everybody may think of an example of what I'm going to say. Suppose you're very, very efficient on your local fight on crime. If you have multinational criminal organizations, well, these criminal organizations will relocate to other countries. So we may see in other countries, if one of Latin American country is very efficient in fighting these gangs and there is no cooperation, the gangs will move. They're very, they move around. They move around and they know the areas quite well and they have local offshoots. So that would be my take here.
Yes, I think the points you make are very relevant also for us right now with cybersecurity and the different conflicts around the world. There is a big concern, conflict in Europe right now and also now in the Middle East and elsewhere. So that cooperation is the only way. And this is why Switzerland also is seeking more cooperation with the European Union in order to be able to trace very, very quickly some criminal activities. But Tatiana, are there more questions?
Yes, I want to take this question. The new president of Venezuela, working remotely from the USA, is trading with Venezuelan gold, oil, rare minerals, etc. Are these commodities of Venezuelan origin sold also within Latin America?
Not sure. I'm not sure I have a clear. I have information. This is a very, specific information on those type of transactions. I'm not aware, for example, that it's being traded with my country, at least, but it may happen. I'm not sure.
Then I have more than a question, a reflection on the relevance of corruption in the countries to have better trade and international regional cooperation.
Well, corruption is a profitable business from an individual viewpoint, but a terrible business for the country. It has so many negative, externalities in other activities, and sometimes you go into countries where people, and I worked all around. I've been finance minister in Chile, but I've worked as advisor to several countries in the region. And when you go to a country and you discover that in some places they say, well, I went into a corrupt organization, and I discovered that I could not survive if I did not work like that. So that is a very complicated issue, and an issue where we don't rank very well. Linda, of course, has seen this, and at the World Economic Forum, we have this worldwide indices of corruption, where Latin America does not look very well. But within Latin America, we have a group of countries that are less, where corruption is less important. Among them, Uruguay, Chile, for example, and probably Costa Rica as well. But this is a very touchy issue. On my own research, corruption discourages foreign investment, for example. It helps that some countries do not recognize, and you may think this is a joke, but it's not. Some countries in the developed world recognized some time ago bribes as a legitimate expense for tax purposes. No longer. And I think it should be, no one should accept a bribe as a legitimate expense for tax purposes. So I think corruption is a very important issue. Let me just mention that the more open your economy is, the less prone to just, the more you have on rules rather than discretion, probably will be good ways to discourage corruption. And fighting corruption is a very important issue. It's a crucial issue for our countries. So also that the punishments for those corrupt activities should be very high. And countries that have gone into that, for example, corruption in some, it's just bribing, but in every corrupt transaction, there are two parties. So there's the private sector, and regularly, although it's not in all cases, but there may be a public official. So the two sides need to have an agreement, so you should not just say, well, corruption is an issue that comes with public people that work in the public sector. No, there's always someone who is paying the price. So this is an issue that many organizations have been trying to deal with for a long time. We have been only partially successful in some countries, but in other countries, corruption is pervasive. Tatiana, you're on mute.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Tatiana.
Sorry, we are getting more questions about corruption and organized crime. I don't know whether we have time. You said you have to leave.
I can probably take one more question, Tatiana. I have to leave now.
Okay, well, this is a long one. Or Linda, did you have one? You're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Felipe, that was excellent. I really think that we we should take the last few minutes for you to tell us about your objectives with your network. I think it's an excellent idea, and I'm sure many of the people listening here today would like to know what your plans are and how they could get involved, especially in their countries, because we have people not only here from Switzerland but from all over listening. So maybe you can spend a few minutes to tell us what you're doing, what your objectives are, and how people could get involved.
Sure. Thank you, Linda. In late 2023, I direct just as a sort of starting point, I direct a center, which is a think tank center at Catholic University in Chile, which is called the Latin American Center for Economic and Social Policies. And this is goes by the acronym CLAPES-UC. And I was, in different conferences abroad, and I discovered that there was no think tank network. There was unofficial networks, but not an official network of think tanks. So what I did in late 23 was to call we did some research at CLAPES and discovered which are to decide which would be the centers that would be most prestigious, most important in the different countries. So in some cases, I knew the directors. In some cases, I did not. So I called them all anyway. I invited them to join the new think tank network of the America called CEPAS, because I'm going to say this in Spanish. CEPAS is es el acuerdo de centros, son la red de centros de pensamiento de las Américas. And we have agreements with, among 8 institutions, CARI in Argentina, the Argentinian Council of International Relations, CEBRI in Brazil, GRADE in Peru, FEDesarrollo in Colombia, México Evalúa in Mexico, CLAPES in Chile, the Atlantic Council in the US, and the most recent member of this alliance is the Real Instituto Elcano in Madrid, which became part of CEPAS, and whose the president of the Elcano, which is a highly prestigious institution in Spain and Europe, is the King Philip VI is the president of Elcano. And what we do is we cooperate on research. We have some regional research on several areas, like security, for example, like growth, like artificial intelligence. We're looking into that. And we have a meeting every year. The inaugural meeting was in Chile, and our keynote speaker was Jeffrey Sachs, who came to deliver a keynote address. And we will have the second meeting this May, late May, in Brazil. And as the Pacific Alliance, Linda, we have a rotating presidency here. So I will leave the presidency of CEPAS and we will welcome Julia Diaz-Leite, the head of CEBRI, to be the next president of CEPAS. And the one thing is, for those of you who speak Spanish, CEPAS is not just a random name. Es la red de centros de pensamiento de las Américas, but CEPAS is also the type of wine you are drinking. So I'm very fond of good wine. So, and as people say, life is too short for bad wine. So.
And you have excellent wines in Chile. So this is you're very well placed for that.
Yeah.
And the rotating presidency is a little bit like our federal council here in Switzerland, where they rotate every year.
And it's good. It's interesting. I think it's important that you have a rotating president. So no one stays and stays and stays, and when it rotates, everybody has to be at the helm, after a while. And it's more, you build better institutions and not just personalized institutions.
Yes.
Excellent.
Well, Philippe, do you want to say something before I close?
Just to thank this opportunity. It's been great talking here with you, and and interacting remotely with the audience. And maybe at some point we will do this, in physical presence.
Exactly. That would be fantastic.
That would be great. What about you,
By the
Philippe?
way, I just want to say, I mentioned it when we met remotely on our last meeting, that I'm going to be in Lugano. Just it's coincidence. I don't go every day to Lugano. In fact, I don't know Lugano, but I was invited to a conference, which will happen May 22nd and 23rd, which is called Decentralized Lugano.
Oh, it's in May, not in April.
No, it's May 22nd and 23rd, I think.
Okay, because I thought it was April. I'm going to be here, so we should try to organize for you to come to Zurich. Would you have time to come to
Well,
Zurich?
let's talk.
Yep.
I'm not sure.
Okay, let's do that. That would be fantastic.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Okay, Philippe, do you want to say something before I close?
Well, on my side, I really enjoyed very much our discussion, Professor Larrain. I think you brought a very good insight in quite a few issues now, which are crucial around the world, and therefore you gave us some confidence in where we are going, what's going to come up, but also you gave up a possibility to see that there is going to be a way forward. There's going to be a way forward. It might not be what would have been otherwise without these conflicts that we have right now, but nevertheless, also for Latin America, there will be some possibilities, some opportunities to take appropriate measures so that the impact won't be too large. So looking forward to see you in Lugano in the month of May. Lugano is beautiful, palm trees and so on, lake, and very, very interesting conferences, certainly. So thank you very much, and wishing you a very nice day in Santiago.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Dear viewers, I hope you can agree that it was tremendously insightful and rewarding, as expected. Thank you very much, Professor Larrain, for sharing your thoughts, outlining different scenarios, and putting everything in perspective for us. Thank you, Philippe, for providing the structure and basis for this powerful moment, and also you, Linda, for suggesting inviting our speaker in the first place. Dear viewers, it was wonderful to see you connect today. As always, you will have a Zoom inquiry tomorrow where you can share comments that have not been answered in the framework of this webinar. I will be happy to forward them to our speaker. And the recording will be on our YouTube channel, LATCAM Switzerland, very shortly. Once more, thank you all for your interest. I hope to see you again on the next occasion very soon. Till then, all the best, be safe, and goodbye.